Thank you very much, Alice, for welcoming us to Edinburgh and to this venue. It's a room that we were in before. I think it was the room we held our conference in just after the NDREF membership surge, a historic moment for the party. So it's really nice to be back here. Better still, as Alice said, to be back here just after another historic moment for the Scottish Green Party, our first ever by-election win anywhere in Scotland. So I also want to recognise the work and the inspirational campaign to get Shona Hoy, or as we in Glasgow know her, Shona, Hoy, 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 elected to Glasgow City Council. And if you were here early enough, when we had a little bit of drama beginning of the conference, I hope very much that you enjoyed the innovative, immersive FBU fringe that took place outside the building. I think that's a creative approach to engagement with the conference, so thank you to them very much. Lorna's going to say a little bit more as well about that Glasgow campaign, but if you haven't had a chance to look at the conference brochure and just turn to the page inside with this photograph, and yeah, love you Edinburgh pals, but count them, all 11 of them, count all 11 of them. And I'm sure that many of you will have a chance to speak, not just to our councillors in groups like Glasgow and Edinburgh, but our councillors right around the country and our other candidates who are doing so much to spread that green message. Listen, we are now well into the second half of our first ever term in government. And we've got just over 2 years until the next Scottish Parliament election. So it's a really important moment that we take some time to refocus on why we entered government. I'm really hoping that whoever's editing my speech live will please stop. To refocus on why we entered government, look at what we've achieved over the last couple of years, also at the work we still got to do, but also on the new challenges that are emerging right now, that demand new action from government. When we were first approached about the idea of joining the Scottish Government, almost 3 years ago now, our first task was to ask you, our party members, what the priorities should be. And among the really broad range of green policies, it was clear that one of the most important was the need to address unfair rents. We listened and we committed to delivering a new deal for tenants to address the imbalance of power in private renting in particular. It's a deal that was grounded in the principle that housing is a human right, a deal that means that people who rent can feel secure, and a deal that turns a rented flat or house into a home. It's a priority that I feel particularly strongly about. I know what it's like to be harassed out of a flat by an abusive landlord. I know what it's like to be left with debts when a joint tenancy ends badly, or forced to move from a home that I like because of a choice that somebody else imposed without any justification. So I'm really proud that as a party of government, we can deliver that new deal for tenants. But as the cost of living crisis began to bite, we knew that we had to act urgently as well as working on that long-term reform. And so I was very pleased that the first piece of legislation that the Scottish Greens delivered in government brought in an emergency rent freeze. It's something that has helped many thousands of people over the last 18 months, protecting them against literally unendurable rent hikes. And critically, it was legislation that, despite some of the criticisms at the time, withstood the legal challenge that was brought against it in the Court of Session. If we had failed that test, we would have done more harm than good. And the claims that the emergency rent cap would also lead to a reduction in the available property have also proved to be false, with the number of registered rented properties in Scotland actually increasing during the period of the cap. But here in Scotland, just as in other parts of the UK where tenants haven't had that protection against annual rent rises, rents have continued to rise in between tenancies. And that's just one aspect of a system that isn't delivering that human right to housing in the way that it should. So I'm proud that last month I was able to press on with the next step in delivering that new deal for tenants by publishing the housing bill. And that will bring in, finally bring in a permanent system of rent controls for Scotland. Because we should never accept that rents can simply spiral out of control, satisfying only those who hold the power in a broken housing market. And because people who rent their home should have just as much right as everybody else to make their house into a home, the new bill will also give a wide range of other rights. Things like the right to keep pets and to decorate. These are not luxuries or add-ons. These are fundamental issues that contribute to people's well-being and happiness at home. We'll be reclaiming millions of pounds of unclaimed deposits and using that to fund services to support tenants. And we're making changes that strengthen the power to challenge evictions, protect people in tenancies who've experienced domestic abuse, and give people rights when a joint tenancy ends. This bill will help to make renting a long-term and secure option in the way that is in many other European countries. And as we take that bill through Parliament, I'll be working really closely with our Green colleague Ariane Burgess in her role as convener of the Holyrood Committee that leads on scrutinising housing. I've been advocating change like this in Parliament for well over a decade now. And the case has also been built steadily by housing campaigners across the country as well. But make no mistake, it's happening now because you made the choice. You made tenants' rights a priority, and you gave us the chance to do more than just make speeches about it. You gave us the chance to make this a reality. Now, we all know, it feels like every time in the last few years I've said it's been a tough year. It's been a really tough several years, in fact, in so many different ways. And this year has been tough as well, with the UK continuing to impose deep cuts as they continue their brutal austerity agenda. But even against that backdrop, we've been determined to continue progress on green priorities. Not only did we achieve record funding for climate action, nature restoration, and decarbonising our homes, we've continued the transformational policies like the Scottish Child Payment, lifting 100,000 children out of poverty and scrapping school meal debt across the whole of Scotland. On that last issue, I want to pay tribute to our colleague Ross Greer as well. It was his investigation that first revealed how many children in this country were going hungry in schools and how many families were being chased for debts they simply couldn't afford to pay. No parent should be kept awake at night worried about how they're going to pay for their children to eat. And with Scottish Greens in government, we've been able to act, wiping out over £1 million of debt to councils, a constant source of anxiety hanging over people's heads, and one that we've been able to remove. And we're continuing with things like investment in school kitchens, working to ensure that every child in Scotland's primary schools will receive free school meals as well. We've funded this kind of work and much more with the most progressive income tax system anywhere in the UK. Greens have been leading the case for using Scotland's powers to develop progressive income tax policies. We've been leading that case for well over a decade. And once again, this year, we've gone further. Due to the changes that we secured, the top 5% of earners will be contributing more to maintaining our public services. The newest changes come into effect today. And I believe it's right and fair that here in Scotland, we are asking the wealthiest people to pay their share to fund things like a Scottish Child Payment that's lifting families out of poverty, delivering a real living wage for public sector contracts, and supporting the services that we all rely on daily. But this year, as every year, we live with the stark reminder as well of what Scotland's missing out on. the basic powers of a normal, independent country to raise money, to invest in public services and a green economy, and to rebalance wealth. Austerity has been the choice of this Tory Westminster government for the last 14 years. It's been imposed on Scotland for all of those years to the detriment of our communities and our public services, both nationally and locally. Like many people, and I'm sure like many of you, I'll be delighted come election night to enjoy watching those little blue dots on the map disappear one by one. But it will only really be worth celebrating in the morning if an incoming government ditches the Tory fiscal rules, ditches the Tory spending limits, and ditches Tory austerity that is harming the lives of so many. We do need to see the back of this toxic Tory government, but if Labour continue their current determination to offer status quo politics and status quo austerity, it would be a betrayal of everyone voting for change. Our party grew out of the ecological movements of the 20th century. And we've been defined more than anything by the cause of environmental and social justice going hand in hand. The climate and nature emergency is the reason that many of us in this room became active in green politics. It is no longer merely an imminent threat. It is here and it is now. It is a clear and present danger to all of us and to the living world around us. It is the defining issue not just for this generation, it will be so for every generation. And yet we need to be honest, the coherent emergency response that it demands is still lacking. We've had a political system largely unwilling or unable to take the radical action that's necessary to halt catastrophic global heating. And it has been our duty as the Green Movement to be the political voice for climate action. Last month, the UK Climate Change Committee, the independent advisory body to both Scottish and UK governments, concluded that Scotland is almost certainly going to miss the 2030 climate target. Now, Scotland has had legally binding climate targets for a decade and a half now. And back at the start of that process, I had the privilege of chairing the parliamentary committee that scrutinised the first Climate Change Act. At first, I was really taken aback by the ease with which consensus seemed to be emerging. There was a strong, united civil society demand from environmental organisations, of course, and campaigners, but also from trade unions, from religious communities, from industry, from anti-poverty organisations. That strong, united civil society demand was very, very clear. But there was also political consensus in Parliament. Every single political party seeking to make the bill stronger, and the handful of outright climate deniers seemed to be left marginalised. But by the time the final debates on that first Climate Change Act were taking place to pass the legislation, I felt that the reason for that early, easy consensus was becoming clear, and I felt that it was actually nothing to celebrate. In the final debate on the bill, I said, targets alone are not enough. They are necessary but not sufficient. They will not be achieved without a radical shift in policy on transport, housing, land use, food and energy. And a few months later, as we were debating the Copenhagen COP, I told Parliament that we had in fact achieved only consensus of intent. We'd in fact taken the easy path of agreeing the targets we wanted to reach, but not agreeing how we were going to reach them. In fact, Scottish politics at that time and since had a complete lack of consensus on the actions that would be necessary. Scotland's done really, really well on decarbonising energy production, but that was already happening before that legislation was in place, and it was not accelerated by it. And in other sectors, transport, land use, heating, we've seen 15 years of largely flatline emissions. Now, if successive Scottish and UK governments had taken the actions needed, I'm in absolutely no doubt that we would be on track for that 2030 target. Instead, too many politicians in every other political party engaged in mutual backslapping about world-leading targets, while at the same time demanding ever more money for road building, supporting relentless aviation growth, lobbying for status quo rural policies to the benefit of big landowners, and cheering to the rafters every time a new oil and gas licence was announced. The failure to unite on the action is the reason why now it's clear that we should be decades ahead of where we are now. And we would have been decades ahead of where we are now if Scotland had implemented the policies that we, as Scottish Greens, had been advocating for years. Well, the warnings now about that 2030 target need to be a wake-up call to everyone. Scotland needs a reset on climate policy. We will have to make fundamental changes as a result of that report, not just to stay within the law, but to shift the emphasis from targets onto accelerated action. Targets do matter, but they matter if we use them to focus our minds on the action. They must never be treated as a substitute for action. That 2030 target was set back in 2019, in the midst of global climate strikes by young people around the world. And across the political divide, we once again saw the emergence of consensus of intent. All political parties rushing to declare a climate emergency. But that was the easy part. The hard part of actually deciding how we're going to achieve those targets and how we rapidly deliver changes to the way we travel, the way we heat our homes, use our land and power our industries. That's the hard task still facing us. And as Scottish Greens, we have a responsibility not just to advocate for accelerated action, but to make it happen. Affordable and accessible public transport for everyone, warmer, greener homes, a just transition in the North Sea, and a rapid restoration of nature to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And the communities most reliant on the industries of the past can and must be on the front line of our shift to a fairer, greener, and more sustainable future. They can be the engine that powers our shift away from dirty fossil fuels toward a clean, green, renewable energy system. One of the biggest areas of policy that Scottish Greens are responsible for in government is decarbonising our homes. And even while they were issuing that stark warning on the 2030 target, the UK Climate Change Committee held up our action on this agenda as a template for the rest of the UK to follow, showing how we can urgently shift away from our dependence on gas to heat our homes and instead use the plentiful renewable energy supplies that we have here in Scotland. Now, we consulted on those plans earlier this year, and the challenge now is to get the legislation over the line in the face of the coordinated and concerted opposition that we know we'll face from those who benefit from the status quo. But we also need to see increased, accelerated ambition in those other areas of policy that were highlighted in the report that remain our biggest emitters: agriculture, transport, industry. This needs to be a shared mission right across the Scottish Government if we're going to hold on to the hope of delivering the change that's needed. And as for consensus, I think we need to recognise that complete political consensus on the action may well be impossible, as the Tories here in Scotland drag climate policy into their toxic culture war space, just as Rishi Sunak has done. We cannot afford to dilute or delay action in the hope of achieving consensus with those who will always prioritise the free market extremism of the Tufton Street junk tanks. And we must never use the limits of devolution as an excuse not to act. But we do need to recognise that reserved powers are currently being exercised by a government that is as irresponsible and dangerous on climate as they are on every other aspect of our society. As a result of their anti-climate agenda, we're seeing green investment put at risk And we're seeing rising hostility to climate action in the UK politics and media. This is a Tory government that is trying to drill its way out of a crisis, that's delaying the action that will make a difference, and that's even in the process of opening a new coal mine. We cannot leave our future in their hands. They're a government that knows that Scotland's abundant, clean, green energy is among the cheapest electricity we can generate, but they're still failing to pass on the benefit of those low prices of generation to consumers, to cut the cost of living and to create real incentives to shift away from fossil fuels for heat and transport. But neither can we sit back and wait for Labour to take this climate crisis seriously, not when Keir Starmer has already given us 28 billion reasons not to trust him on this issue. Even with the most important powers to make a difference, both the main Westminster parties are trying to sell off ever more of our North Sea to the highest bidder. The Scottish Greens will never support drilling in Rosebank, not now, not ever, and Labour must not be allowed to nod it through if they form a government. The world around us is changing, and it is deplorable that some appear happy to treat even the most basic proposals for a response as though they represent some kind of form of extremism, while they themselves continue to back a failed economic model that has brought the crisis about. Time and time again, climate policies are being obstructed and opposed by those who just want to draw a political dividing line for their own self-interest, no matter the cost to people and planet. That's why we still need Greens more than ever, not just making the case for climate action, but making it happen. And that was the fundamental reason we chose to enter government in 2021, because we cannot demand climate action and then only recoil when we're asked to deliver it. Even at the start of this journey, we knew that we were starting far too late on many of these issues. Like the rest of the world, Scotland has been held back by decades of propaganda and climate denial conspiracies from the fossil fuel industry and by the politicians who do their bidding. And it takes decades to fundamentally change how we produce our food, to see native forests regenerate and regrow, and to make sure that every home in Scotland is well insulated and heated with renewables. So we are indeed far behind where we should be, but the only response to that is to accelerate action now. Let's be clear. The Climate Change Committee itself has been clear. Scotland's ultimate goal of reaching net zero by 2045 is absolutely still achievable, but only if we accelerate action now. There will be difficult decisions, some of them immediate, as the Scottish Government responds to the CCC report, and other challenging decisions lie further ahead of us. But we need to recognise that this is a pivotal moment in our climate journey. It does require a reset of climate policy from the Scottish Government, and we, as Scottish Greens, we have a responsibility to insist that that happens and to shape it. Scotland's climate targets are important, but they are only meaningful with an ambitious acceleration of action to actually make them achievable. We need that acceleration of action going far beyond what's been done before. And we know that if we get this right, we're not just ensuring that our planet is habitable for future generations, critical though that is, we'll also be giving people in the here and now the warmer homes that they need, that are cheaper to heat. We'll be creating well-paid, highly skilled, unionised jobs that will still be here for decades to come. And we'll be getting commuters out of traffic jams and onto affordable, reliable public transport. Everyone benefits from climate action, and now is the time we must accelerate it.